Hey everybody, welcome back. This is Paul Casper here, and today's lesson we're going to be talking about the drawing tools in Flash Professional CS6. Now a lot of us have used other drawing applications such as Adobe Illustrator or Adobe Photoshop to do most of our graphical work. Just know that within Flash you do have the option to create a lot of native artwork. Now typically I do not create my own native artwork within Flash simply because if I need to repurpose that artwork, it's a lot easier to have the Illustrator version, for instance, than to get the artwork out of Flash and put into maybe another print application. So myself, I typically do most of my artwork in Illustrator, but just know there are plenty of drawing tools in Flash, and this lesson is going to give us the introduction on how to use some of those and how to control some of the things in there. So with that, here we go. Alright, so the first way we're going to start to work with drawing tools in Flash is to use Flash's default way to draw, which is merge mode. In merge mode, you can have multiple objects that overlap with each other and actually take shapes, and you can do some really interesting things. So to do that, by default, we're going to just start. First thing I'm going to do is draw a couple shapes. I'm just going to draw a rectangle, constrain the proportions by holding Shift, make a perfect square, and then I'm going to draw an oval, change the color to something different so we can see the difference here, and notice now I've got a square and a circle. With our selection tool, the black arrow, we can click and move these around just like we're used to, separately. But notice when I select an object, there's this grid pattern on there. This grid pattern is going to indicate we're working with a drawing object which can then be merged with other objects that are on the same layer. So if I overlap these two objects and I move the same one, oh, that's no problem, no big deal. But if I overlap them and select another object and move it, look what happens. We lose where that shape overlapped. Again, move it. So the shapes actually merge, and you can actually get some pretty interesting shapes that you probably wouldn't have been able to get as fast with the pen tool. So it's just another way to draw. A lot of Flash enthusiasts who have only known how to draw in Flash love this. Others of us who have learned other draw programs stick with those. So you can do what's comfortable for you. That's no problem. One other thing about shapes drawn in merge mode is if you hover over the edge of a shape, you can actually click and drag the edge of that shape out pretty easily. So you can add some interesting things with that as well. You can select the object by clicking on the fill, moving it. But notice if you hover over the edge after it's selected, you can only move it. You no longer get that icon with the bend. If you want to stop shapes from overlapping and taking pieces and merging from each other, you can simply select each drawing object individually and group it with itself. So I'm going to select what used to be the square, go to Modify, Group, and once I group that merge object with itself, it now has a bounding box around it and it's protected. When I select it, you don't get that grid pattern. When I try to overlap it and move stuff, things are safe. So if I do end up drawing something in merge mode, which I don't do very often, but I want to stop it from merging at some point, I'll grab the objects individually and group them with themselves. Instead of going to Modify Group, notice there's a quick key of Command G as well. So I'm going to select what used to be my circle, hit Command G, group it, and now I've got two objects that we can now move around freely on the same layer that are not going to hurt each other. Another way to protect these that we're going to get into in a future lesson is you could actually convert each of these pieces of artwork into a symbol, or you could make two different layers, draw each piece of art on their own separate layer, and that way they cannot interact. So the only time merge mode really lets you take the pieces from multiple pieces of artwork are if they're on the same layer. The other way to draw in Flash is to draw in object mode. This is the mode that most of us are probably familiar with working in from our other draw programs, but what it does is it allows shapes to overlap without merging them, even if they're on the same layer, and you don't have to group them, you don't have to do any of that stuff. So to do that, I'm going to create a new layer in my timeline. I might even name that layer Object Mode. And I'm going to hide layer 1, which is my merge mode objects. And to work on Object Mode layer, I'm going to select it, and I'm going to draw the same shapes. So I'm going to draw a circle again. But before I draw that circle, I need to pay attention to the bottom of the tool panel. When I grabbed that circle, I have the option to click this little button at the bottom that converts it to object drawing. So I'm going to press that button in, and now when I draw that shape, notice how by default it is protected. It's got that box around it. So when I draw a rectangle, same thing. I can select both those objects, and I'm actually going to select the rectangle, go over to the properties, change the color so we can see the overlap a little bit better, and I'm going to move them, and they do not interact. They're on the same layer, but they do not interact. They do not merge with each other. So this is the way when I draw in Flash I typically draw, but if you're more comfortable, you want to experiment and explore some of the merge drawing mode, more power to you. Alright, now that we've got a good handle on merge mode and object drawing mode in Flash, let's take a look at a few of the actual drawing tools beyond just the oval and rectangle tool that we've currently used. First thing I'm going to do is just delete my layers here. I'm going to view and clear that off so we can start clean. Alright, so the first thing I want to show you guys is going to be the pen tool. The pen tool is going to act just like it does on all the rest of our drawing programs like Illustrator. So we love the pen tool, best way to draw in my opinion. When you select the pen tool, notice at the bottom of the tools panel you also get the object drawing mode option. You can turn it off or turn it on. Let's keep our pen tool with object drawing mode on so it works like we're familiar with. And when we use the pen tool, it is amazing. Right? We love the pen tool. We've learned to love it. We do lots of fun stuff with the pen tool. Again, I drew in object mode so you can move it with the selection tool. If you use your sub-selection tool, which is the white arrow tool here, you can also click on the individual anchor points, move those around just like we're used to. You can move the handlebars, the directional handlebars here, to change the curves, lengthen and shorten, all that good stuff. You can also use the convert anchor point tool, which we're used to break those curves. So stuff we're all familiar with from our days in Illustrator. In addition to the pen tool, we can also use a lot of other drawing tools, such as the line tool. The line tool is pretty straightforward. It can draw, wait for it, lines. So when you want to draw a line, I'm going to again just make sure I've got object mode selected, which I do. It shows it's depressed here. But I can also look over in the properties panel and notice that it's context sensitive here. So as you select different drawing tools, the properties are going to change for that specific tool. I can change the stroke width of my line, also the color. So I'm just going to maybe do a 2-pixel stroke here. Keep it solid. You can change the end caps if you want to. And let's not show that during any more podcasts. Thank you very much. And we're going to draw lines. Okay, line tool, constrain proportions just like other tools. You click and drag. You can change any angle you want. draw it at these angles, but you can snap it to 45 degrees by holding shift. Hold shift and draw, straight line, 45-degree angle, 90-degree, and you can go all the way around, whatever direction you want. So if you don't hold shift, you can put it anywhere. If you hold shift, you can strain to 45-degree points. So that's the line tool, pretty basic. Okay, so you guys might have noticed at the beginning of when I showed you the merge and object mode, we saw we had the rectangle tool and the oval tool, but if you look below those, we've also got a second set of rectangle and oval tools. So we've got our regular tools up here, rectangle and oval, but we've also got these primitive tools. Notice how the icons are different. The primitive tools have these little dots in the edge, this line, and I'm going to show you the difference right now. So I'm just going to draw a regular rectangle in object drawing mode real quick. And I'm going to switch my tool to the rectangle primitive tool. Draw another one fairly similar. Alright, so the first one, notice the properties when I select it, because it's a regular drawing object we can basically only change the stroke. How thick is the stroke? How small is it? We can adjust the colors if we want to, which, why not? Let's do that. Beautiful colors. And we can change maybe a few of these little things. Look at the properties panel when I select the rectangle primitive. We've got all the same fill and stroke options, but in addition, we've also got some rectangle options. So what's the rectangle option? Notice these little bent corners here. We can actually change the corners radiuses of the primitive objects. So a negative number will make the corners go in, and a positive number will just round the corners ever so nicely until we go so far it actually turns it into a circle. So primitive shapes let us do some pretty neat things. Now notice this little chain link icon here. If you want to change the corner radius on separate corners, not have them all be exactly the same, you can unlink that chain link and you can go in and you can type the values that you want. So if I go 50 in the upper left, but I've still got a negative number in these other ones, notice our shape. I've got a regular roundness in the upper left and these other ones are still in the negative. So you can have a lot of fun with these primitive shapes. And again, because we drew these in object mode, they are protected against each other. So real quick, same concept for the ovals. If I draw a regular oval, and if I draw a oval primitive, again, context sensitive. The oval regular has basically the same fill and stroke options that we're used to seeing, but the oval primitive, check this out. It's got start angles and end angles. So we can have a Pac-Man. We can change the values. And you know what? This ragged stroke is not helping us much. There we go. We'll change that back to solid. By solid, I mean solid. And we can edit and adjust. Not only can you change the start angle and end angle to create these pies, but you can also change the inner radius of the circle. And you can give it a little donut hole. So we've got regular shapes and primitive shapes when it comes to ovals and rectangles. If you remember anything, just remember the rectangles are the basic ones. I'm sorry, the regular tools are the basic ones, and the primitive tools give you these amazing options where you can do some pretty cool things with the radiuses and the corners and that kind of thing. Underneath the primitive tools of the rectangle and the circle, let's take a look at the Polystar. Again, context sensitive. Depending on the tool you choose, your properties are going to change. When it comes to the Polystar tool, I want to make sure you guys notice this tools setting option. Under tool settings, you click the options button, and in there you can change the style that you want, you can change the number of sides, and also the different point sizes there within the stars. I'm just going to do a polygon, and I'm going to give it 3 sides, which is going to make it a triangle. So rather than taking the pen tool and drawing out a triangle, or drawing a rectangle and removing an anchor point from one of the corners, I'm going to use the Polystar tool to create a triangle from this point. I'm going to get rid of the star point size, keep the 3 sides, and click OK. Now, Polystar tool again, we're in object drawing mode. If you click and drag, you now have a triangle. But again, holding shift helps you constrain. So do I want a triangle facing up? Do I want it facing to the side? Do I want it facing down? To the left? I'm just going to have a regular triangle, just like so. Again, object drawing mode is protected, and this is actually a good point because if you want to get back into the merge drawing mode of an object that is done in object drawing mode, you can do a couple different things. First thing, you can double click on that shape to get inside of the object. And we are familiar with this from Illustrator. When you're in a group and you double click on it, you can get into isolation mode. That's what we just did on this triangle. I double clicked on it, got into isolation mode. Now I can move these pieces separately just like I did before. I'm going to undo a couple times by hitting Command Z to get back to where I was. But to get out of isolation mode of that object, I can either hit this back arrow a couple times, get back to the drawing object, or if I'm in isolation mode, I can just double click on the outside of that object and it brings me right out to the top level. So if you need to go back in and edit something you've done in object mode in a merge mode type of way, you can just double click on it. I'm going to get out of isolation mode one more time, and there's also one way you can take an object that's been drawn in object mode and turn it into a drawing object. And that is by breaking it apart. So select the object you want to break apart, then go to Modify, Break Apart. Notice the quick key of Command B, which I use quite a bit. So I'm just going to break it apart, and when you break it apart, notice now you've got the grid of merge drawing mode. Alright, so now that we've used some of the basic drawing tools, here in Flash, I just want to get into real quickly, that's going to set us up for our next project, how to change the color of different objects and how to apply and control gradients to them. So we've got all kinds of neat shapes drawn on our stage right now. I'm just going to grab one of them. In this case, it's going to be the rectangle primitive. And I'm going to go down in design mode here in Flash, and there's the color panel. Notice in the color panel, we've got our stroke color, our fill color, but in addition we've got a drop down that says the color type. Currently all we've really used was solid, but notice that there's some different gradients. We can do a linear gradient, radial gradient, and even a bitmap fill, so we can fill it with a bitmap picture. I'm going to start with a linear gradient. Linear means line, gradient that goes straight across. Notice we've got our gradient here, and as I adjust that, by default it turned black and white, but I can change the spread between the gradient. So if you look at my object, which I'll just move closer to my color panel here so we can see what's happening. Wide object, and more gradients. These little color stops, if you want to change the color of your gradient, you can double click on it to bring up your color picker. So I changed the left to purple. Should I change the right to orange, or I'm sorry, yellow? And I'm just going to separate them, smooth them out a little bit more space. And just for fun, notice on our arrow here, we get a little plus when we're hovering right on that gradient selector. So I'm just going to click once and add another color stop. Double click on that, add another color that's going to stand out. blue, maybe add another color. It's going to stand out. Adjust some things, just pick some different colors. So we can make as beautiful or not beautiful a gradient as we want. But what we have to do is select the color and change the fill to gradient. Notice there's a flow, you can extend it, you can also reflect it, and you can repeat it. So some other kind of options in here, but something's neat. So not only can you create these gradients that just go from start to finish, but if you go to your tool panel and underneath the free transform tool, you've got the gradient transform. So by selecting the gradient transform and the object that you'll have the gradient applied to, you can actually stretch the gradient across more to smooth it out even more if you'd like. You can also click and drag on this little circle here and change the angle and stretch it. So in this way, you really have some nice control over your gradient. Now, what happens if you want to resize an object? Notice with your selection tool, unlike Illustrator, if you have an object selected, you don't get those little boxes in the corners, the bounding box, like pull and stretch and shear and rotate and all that good stuff. In order to transform an object from any drawing mode that you've done, you've got to use the free transform tool. So with the free transform tool, select your object and you can now stretch it and scale it and squish it. And if you hover over the top, look really closely at that icon, you can shear it. Hover over the corner, you can rotate it. And pay special attention to the little white dot in the center of that object right now. When you move that white dot by clicking and dragging on it, you're then changing the registration point. So where are these transforms originating from? I want to rotate from the corner here. I can rotate from the corner. I want to scale it from there, keep it there. Maybe I want to scale it from here. Very good. You can scale it from there. So when you want to change how a drawing object looks, you can't just click on it and start pulling on handlebars. You've actually got to select your transform tool first, then select the object and make the changes you'd like. And just like in Illustrator, if you hold shift, you can constrain the proportions so you don't mess up your shape. Hold shift, make sure you hold shift, and you resize things. Alright, so there are some of the basics of the Flash CS6 draw tools. Again, I do most of my creative work outside of Flash as far as graphics go, and I bring that stuff in. I use Flash typically for the animation and the interactivity. Feel free to dig deeper and learn a little bit more about the Flash draw tools. There's definitely more in there I didn't get to, but this is definitely a good start on the basics, and we'll see you next time.